All right, so now that we have the image color corrected and ready to go, all natural looking and ready for the creative process, we're gonna jump into actually color grading this and doing the creative part of the grading process. So I've got our image here all corrected and ready to go, delogged, and it's ready. And I'm gonna jump into and show you a few of the different tools that you're gonna use to color grade your video. Now, the color grading process is different from the color correction process, where correction is all about just correcting it. Well, just fixing it, making sure that everything is normal and natural. Color grading is where you get into the creative part of the process, where you get to kind of tweak your colors and change it based on your color schemes or the mood that you're going for. And not just the colors, but also the exposure. So there's a lot you can do here. And so I'm just going to walk you through some of these tools. Now, the first tool is going to be your curves tool. There's two different types of curves. There's RGB curves, and then there's hue saturation curves. So first I'm going to talk about the RGB curves. This right here is an RGB curve, and basically we have the ability to set the exposure of our image based on midtones, shadows, highlights, different exposure areas of the image, and then we can also change the red, green, and blue levels. Now, honestly, I don't use RGB curves that much when I'm color grading. I find that the other tools are easier to use and allow me to get what I need. However, it is a tool that you should know how to use just in case there's a situation that comes up where you do need it. So basically in the RGB curves, we've got a line here, and this is indicating where our shadows are here at the bottom and where our highlights are here at the top. And any adjustment to this line up or down will increase or decrease the exposure. So for example, if we wanted to increase our midtones, we could click on it to create a point in the middle and then drag that point up, and that will increase our midtones. Likewise, we could do the exact same thing in the shadows. We could lift our shadows to make them brighter or darken them to make them darker. Now at the bottom, we've got our black point. So you can use this to set the black point of your image. If you wanted kind of a faded, matted look in your blacks, you could use that, and we'll bring this to kind of bring that back to normal. You can use that to create, this kind of effect, you know what I mean? And then you can do the same thing with your highlights to bring them down. Now, what a lot of people will do is in the correction part of the process, they will bring their blacks until they hit black, and then they'll bring their highlights across until they hit white. I don't do that. I don't think that it's even necessary. I think that you can just use this tool as needed in order to get the look that you want. So that will adjust your exposure across the board. Now you can do the same thing with your red, green, and blue channels. So for example, the red channel, I could just increase it in the midtones, or I could increase it in the shadows. Okay, whoops. That's way too far. Or I can increase it in the shadows. So you can do all sorts of creative color effects. Notice how just by adjusting the red channel in my image, I've already kind of created a semi color graded, it's a very unique, pretty heavy effect, but an effect nonetheless, kind of a vintage looking effect. So you can adjust how much red there is in your highlights, midtones, and shadows, and then you can do the same thing with your greens and your blues. Again, like I said, I don't use RGB curves that much, but it is good to know how they work. The curves that I more often use are these hue saturation curves, and these are the ones that really allow you to dial in and focus on specific colors. So where RGB curves will let you adjust the red, green, and blue channels of a specific range of exposure values in your image, so like your midtones, your shadows, your highlights, the hue saturation curves will allow you to select specific color ranges. As you can see here, there are quite a few different hue saturation curves here, and each of them does a little bit different things. So this first one is hue versus saturation, where it says hue versus sat here. Okay, what this is doing is it allows you to select a color in your image and then change the saturation of that color. So for example, if I wanted to select the blue in the background here, I could just select a range of blue values and then increase the saturation of those. So if I select this eyedropper tool at the top here, and then I click on that back wall, you'll notice it's going to give me 3 points. And this is going to allow me to draw a curve here to increase the saturation. So if I increase the saturation of this middle point, you'll notice that the wall gets more saturated. Now I can also adjust these endpoints out to select a wider range of colors, which I usually want to do because when I use the eyedropper tool, it's only selecting that specific color that I clicked on. And so I maybe want to select more blues than that. And you'll notice how I can increase or decrease the saturation of that blue. but it's not affecting the rest of the image or any other colors. So that's hue versus saturation. The next one is hue versus hue. This will allow you to select any hue or any color and then change the color of that color. So if we go back and select this blue again, and I'll widen this out so we get a little bit more range here. Basically what I can do is change the hue of it or move it around the color wheel to change the color of that part. So as I push this up, you'll notice it'll go towards green, it'll go towards kind of an orange color there, and I can change the color of that wall. Same thing if I pull it back down, it's going to go back the other direction, so more towards purple and eventually red as well. So you can use that to adjust the color of an object or the color of a specific color in the scene. And that's going to select everything in the scene that is that blue color. The hue versus luma, as you could probably guess, allows you to select a hue and change the luminance or the intensity of it, so lighter or darker. And then there's a couple down here that are not used as often, but still valuable. This is luma versus saturation. So for example, you can select a specific luminance or intensity value. So let's say I wanted to change the saturation of only the shadows in the image. And this is where I use this the most often, is sometimes what I'll do is I'll bring all of my shadows down. This is changing the saturation of just the shadows. And I'll adjust it so that only my shadows are desaturated and everything else is normal saturation. What this can do is just make sure that there's no like green or blue cast happening in your shadows, if that's kind of the effect that you want to go for. And then the last one is saturation versus saturation. I can select a range of colors that are a certain level of saturated and then change the saturation of those colors. So for example, if I wanted to desaturate anything that is saturated beyond, 50%, I could bring this down so that anything that is overly saturated just kind of brings it back to normal. Again, these are a little bit more niche tools that aren't used as often, but they can be used in different ways. So for example, if I were using the curves here and trying to adjust this image, let's say, for example, I wanted to go for kind of a complementary color scheme in this image. Well, the first thing I would do is decide which colors I'm going to go complementary with. And in this case, we've got a lot of warm tones or orange tones, and we also have a lot of blue tones. And so I want to separate those colors and create that color contrast. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is start with the guy's jacket because it's blue, but it's kind of a magenta blue, and I want to push it a little bit more towards teal. So I'm going to use the eyedropper here and select his jacket, which is going to give me a general range of values that I'm working with here, and then just kind of adjust that to where I want. Obviously, I can push it way too far. I can get these kind of colored effects, but I just want to see where I am affecting it the most. And it looks like it's actually about right there. So I'm going to spread this out a little bit more, which makes sense because it was kind of a magenta blue. And then, nope, I went too far. Got to come back a little bit. Then I can take that jacket and adjust the color of it. So I don't want to go too far. I just want to take it from this kind of magenta looking blue and push it into a little bit more of the teal range about right there. And then likewise, I'll grab the exact same range up here on my saturation curves and just increase the saturation of that color. Except in this case, I also want to include the wall behind him. So I'm just going to adjust this endpoint over so that I'm increasing the saturation of the wall behind him and his jacket and making that pop out a little bit more. Okay, then next I want to adjust the warm tones or the orange tones. So I'll go ahead and select an area down here that looks like it's about right and adjust my hue. Notice I can push this really far and change the colors, all sorts of directions. I just want to take this, which is kind of yellow looking, and just push it just slightly towards red, which is going to make it a little bit more orange. That's going to create just a little more contrast between the blue and the orange. So just slightly that direction, not too far. And then it's feeling a little bit too intense, so I might come up here to my saturation curve and just desaturate it a little bit. Do some little adjustments here, and we're getting a fairly good image. Now, obviously, I could spend a lot of time going through and tweaking this and getting it just right, but you can see how we're getting kind of a more complementary color scheme by doing this. So if I go before, this was the before, and then this was the after. Pretty subtle effect. Now, likewise, we could do the opposite, and we could go for an analogous color scheme. So for example, maybe I wanted to push everything kind of towards those warm tones and create kind of a more warm, inviting atmosphere. Then I would do something different with the blues. So for example, let's go ahead and grab the blue from his jacket again. Kind of widen this out so we're affecting all of the blues in the image, because the blue is across the color wheel from the warm or the orange. We want to kind of subdue the blues and push everything towards that warm. So what I'm going to do is take this blue and I'm going to push it quite a bit towards green. Okay, as we push it that direction, in fact, I don't want to affect the back wall as much, so I'm going to adjust this way. And I'm going to push both of those colors quite a bit more towards green. So green is right next to yellow and orange on the color wheel. So if we can go towards green, then we're moving all of our colors towards a more analogous color scheme because they're right next to each other. Now, obviously the effect is a little bit intense, and so we want to take that same range up here on our saturation curve and just desaturate it. So as we pull that saturation down, kind of adjust it here to get it in the right spot. Now you can see that we're getting an image where that blue doesn't pop out as much, and it's creating more of a warm orange kind of analogous color scheme. Okay, so that's how I use the curves tools to adjust my image. So let me just reset all of this, and then we'll talk about the next tool. So the next tool is the color wheels tool, and this is where a lot of your exposure in color grading comes from. Most exposure, like if you look at professional colorists, will do a lot of that in the color wheels. So the color wheels here will allow me to adjust my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights independently, but it'll allow me to change the exposure of each of those, but it'll also allow me to push any color I want into those. So unlike the RGB curves, which only allows you to increase or decrease the red, green, and blue channels, this will allow me to push any color towards any color. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with my exposure tools, which are over here on the left, these sliders. This is where a lot of the creative exposure comes in. Now, what a lot of filmmakers will do, we kind of have this idea that you want to add contrast to your images, especially when they're shooting in log profiles. And so what they'll do immediately is start, bringing down the shadows and getting, their black point until it hits black. And then they'll bring up their midtones so that it's, exposed properly. And then they'll bring up their highlights to just kind of, make sure that it's clean. What happens when you do this and when you adjust your images this way is that you end up with this kind of gritty, very contrasty, very stark contrast image. And it's really not what you want. This is, in fact, one of the biggest mistakes I see with color grading from beginners is this kind of contrasty look that ends up looking really bad. So if I reset that, I'm going to show you an alternate way of doing this. And this is what I do on most of my images. So when I'm color grading this, I want to create a look that feels very natural and filmic and has that cinematic film-like look to it. Now, what a lot of filmmakers will do is when they want that film look, or the film look, they will go in to like their creative tab here and just add this faded film effect, right? Which kind of brings up that black point, mats your blacks like that, and it looks really pretty bad. Or they'll go up to basic correction and just increase their blacks, which essentially does the same thing. The problem with doing this is that even though it's kind of like the trendy look, or has become that, it seems, it really starts to muddy out your blacks and you start to lose detail in those blacks, and it really, really looks bad. So to create that same effect in a more natural way is to use your color wheels. So rather than bringing your shadows down and your midtones up, what we're going to do is actually do the opposite. We're going to bring the midtones down and the shadows up. We're going to start squeezing those two together to get the look that we want. So if I start bringing my midtones down until it's looking pretty dark, then I can bring the shadows up to kind of compensate for it. And then look what happens. Now we end up with this really nice, natural, muted look. Feels very filmic and cinematic, but we're not losing all of this nice detail in our shadows. Now, if I were to push this effect really far, you can really see what it's doing. So I'll bring my midtones all the way down and then bring those shadows up to compensate. Notice how we're just really starting to smush those midtones and shadows together, and it's creating that really cool effect. Now, if you wanted to shoot something that, it made sense to go like this far with the effect on it, then go for it, be my guest. But this is going to be further than I'm usually going to go on something like this. So I'll bring my shadows back down until they're just, maybe barely too dark, about like that, and then start bringing my midtones back up to adjust for it. And then you end up with a really nice, pleasing image that just feels natural, but that also has kind of a muted cinematic filmic look. Now, the last thing with the color wheels that I was talking about is you can push different colors into the shadows, midtones, or highlights in your image. So this is kind of a more stylized effect, but for example, let's say you wanted to push some blue into your shadows. So you would click here in the middle of the color wheel and just drag it slightly towards blue. Now I'm gonna go really far so you can see exactly what that's doing, but it's basically making all of my shadows feel blue. And I can move it around the color wheel to make it more green or teal and adjust it like that. And then, hey, I could go into my midtones and push them the opposite direction to create kind of that teal and orange effect as well. And there we're getting a very vintage kind of looking effect, which tends to happen when you start pushing colors into shadows and midtones. But if that's something that you're going for in your image, then there you go. So if we do a before and after, this is our before shot, and then this is our after with those adjustments made. Now, it's important to keep in mind that color grading is a creative process. So you want to be thinking about what the story is that you're trying to tell. What are you trying to make happen? Obviously, we're thinking about color schemes and thinking about, different colors that are harmonious together, that make sense together. And we want to be combining those colors or separating them, creating color contrast with complementary colors. You want to be thinking about it in those terms, but then also be thinking about the story. Maybe there's an object in the scene that you need to stand out because it has a specific importance in the movie, unlike some other things in the scene. So you might make that pop out with a little bit more saturation or change the color of it. There's a lot of different ways you can use the color grading process to tell stories, to change the way that your viewer perceives the video that they're watching. So that's my color grading process with curves and color wheels. Again, there are so many possibilities and options for every single thing that you shoot. You can go any number of directions with the color and completely change the mood or the feel of the entire project. So feel free to play around with this. Mess around with it, try new things, try pushing colors into different places and seeing what kind of effects you get. And pay attention to the films that you love or commercials that you love. See what they're doing and pay attention to how they're kind of tweaking the colors and changing the direction, the hue, the saturation, the intensity of the colors that they're working with in the scene. Anyway, there you go. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about this, let me know and we'll see you on the next video.